Hello, everyone, and happy Monday. Well, can we change our genes? We always say, like Rachel and I were talking about earlier, well, hey, it's my gene. I can't do anything. But Rachel is going to tell us fascinating stories about epigenetic testing, and she's joining me live right now. She is a wellness epigenetic coach. Welcome, Rachel. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. Yeah, epigenetics is something that I find very fascinating. I think it's exciting to work with people when they're looking to find out more about their genes and how we can influence them. And as you said, a lot of times we think, well, it's our genes, we're stuck with them, we can't do anything about it. And we're learning more and more that that's, not the truth, that we can start to influence our genes in meaningful ways. So, a lot of people, this is something new that they've never heard of before. What is epigenetic testing? Like, what are we doing here? And it is something that is new and is becoming more prevalent now. We started off with looking at the genes and then kind of mapping those out over the last decade or so, and really then looking at the individual genes, what they do, kind of how they process in the body, and then, are those things modifiable? And so we find that with proteins and with methylation, that we can modify those genes. And how we influence those genes is by the input from our environment, our food, even our thoughts. They've done lots of studies even on meditation and that it can influence many of your genes. So you asked earlier about, is there a stress gene, right? Like, well, there's a lot of genes that can influence that. There's not one gene does one specific thing per se, but, the body is a very complex system. And so a lot of the genes interact with each other to, if you say, express a certain trait, right? So certain things can produce those anxious feelings. And yeah, we certainly can have an influence on them. Meditation certainly can, change our genetic expression. And then also, believe it or not, the food that we intake can also really change that epigenetic expression. There is a variant of a gene called GAD1, and it is very dependent on the types of food that we eat. And if you eat things like preservatives, MSG, certain grains and things like that, if you have a tendency to express that gene, you can get like anxious feelings and brain fog and that kind of stuff. So sometimes people think that it might be to do with their mood, but actually it could be something to do with what you're eating. And you don't really know that until you look at your genetics and what you might have a propensity to express. So it is a very exciting thing to look at. And certainly as complex humans, it's trying to unravel the pieces, right? And we look at the epigenetics in line with a lot of other things like blood work, what nutrition you're taking in, because all of that will, your hormones, all of that will have an influence on your epigenetics and how you're expressing your particular genes. So you are, obviously born with certain genes and the way that they could express. But as an epigenetic coach, we look at that and say, well, if this is a particular gene that could express in a certain way that we don't want, say producing maybe excess weight or like I said, with the GAD1 gene where it could have brain fog or anxiety, we don't want those, right? So then we have to figure out, how do we turn that gene expression down? It's like a dimmer switch. We want to turn that down so we're not having those experiences. And so it's basically, that's what we look at with epigenetics. And there's a wide variety of genes within the array that we look at. And we look at that to get a whole complete picture of the person and how they're interacting with the world. So, I know one of the questions that you asked was, where can we get epigenetic testing done? So you have to be a certified coach like I am to do the test. And to give the results, you have to have been certified, been trained in this, obviously, because it is a more of a complex thing to look at. And so once you're certified, you can give feedback to people about their genetics and their propensity to express certain genes. And, you know, there's obviously a variety of companies out there now that do this. You know, I signed up with Epiron, which is one of the big companies for epigenetic coaches that have a lot of coaches all across the world, actually. So I'm part of the Epiron tribe, as we like to call it. And, you know, what we do is we look at people's whole picture. We do the testing. It's a simple cheek swab, right? We send it into the lab and then we look at it and we see what comes back. And then we work with the client to figure out how can, if something is being expressed, sometimes it's not, because people may have already been fine-tuning the food that they eat or how they live their lifestyle, the chemicals that they have in their houses and things like that could all influence that. They may have already done a good job, but there's certain other areas that they need to adjust. So we look at the whole picture and then decide, you know, what can we work on? So we look in our epigenetic array at several different things. We look at sleep, we look at stress, nutrition, we look at athletic performance, we look at hormones, we look at environmental toxins, because all of these things can influence our body, right? And how our genes express. And once we look at all of that, we can give a report to the client. And then in ongoing coaching, if that